After concluding that President Assad's government has used chemical weapons, the US decides to arm Syria's rebels. And two interns successfully sue a major film studio in a ruling that could have major implications for the US economy. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. The Syrian government has reacted angrily after the US accused President Assad's forces of using chemical weapons, calling the charges, quote, a caravan of lies. The US says it will now provide direct military aid to rebel groups, though exactly what form this will take is unclear. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Mann Leverett, a Middle East expert and professor at American University who served both in the White House and the State Department. What do you take this announcement to mean exactly?
Well, I think it certainly is a signal to the rest of the world, particularly to the Russians, the French, those who are looking at a Geneva conference to deal with Syria politically in a negotiated way, that the United States is not serious about that. The United States is much more serious about ensuring a continued quagmire in Syria to keep both the Assad government and the rebels essentially fighting each other so that they're not looking at the United States or Israel in the region.
But the White House surrogates say, no, this is to ensure that the rebels have a stronger bargaining position at talks in Geneva or wherever they may be.
They may think that they're trying to just shore up the rebels, but the weapons that they're talking about giving are not going to do anything decisive strategically on the ground, let alone tactically on the ground. It literally will just lead to more and more dead Syrians, and essentially we'll have to come back to the negotiating table with the opposition even weaker, even having further collapse.
I mean, there have been key barriers to the direct arming of the rebels in the past. First of all, is there a foolproof way to ensure that these weapons don't end up with al-Qaeda? Is there any evidence they've sorted that out?
There's no evidence whatsoever. I mean, even Senator McCain's last trip into Syria, he's photographed with people who were kidnapped, said that they were their kidnappers. So the idea that we have any process there to vet, the head of our intelligence agency has actually said that it's gotten even harder now than it was 6 months ago to vet these so-called rebels inside Syria.
But can you see any long-term plan that's now being established then by this or through this move?
I think the long-term plan, you have been hearing it growing increasingly from neoconservative voices, from pro-Israel voices here in Washington, is to keep a quagmire in Syria. Do not allow Assad to win under any cost, under any circumstance, because an Assad victory is an Iranian victory, a Chinese victory, a Russian victory, and a real defeat for the United States. So I think this is about keeping the parties fighting each other in Syria so they're not challenging U.S. dominance in the region.
So it's not about toppling Assad necessarily, but just keeping Iran and Hezbollah and others drained, perhaps, in a very costly war. Meanwhile, hundreds and thousands of people are dying.
Exactly. I mean, for 2 years, President Obama has said Assad has to go. The U.S. position has clearly been regime change, just like it was on Iraq. And keep in mind, the last time the United States put weapons of mass destruction as the reason to invade or arm people in another country was Iraq, and it was entirely manufactured, We're now doing it again. President Bush was responsible for the death of at least 100,000 civilians under the Pentagon's own estimate. Here, with Obama's dirty war, by indirectly supplying so far weapons to rebels inside Syria, the UN now tells us that nearly 100,000 people have been killed. I think the aim here, again, is not to overthrow Assad. We gave up on that. For 2 years, we've been trying it. We have given up on that, and particularly with the insertion of Hezbollah, there has been a strategic turn with the taking of Qusayr. I think at this point, it's almost game over, and we're just trying to keep the people fighting so we don't have to accept defeat.
Are we seeing some wariness on the part of the White House, though, of having ceded so much of the management of this entire conflict to the Gulf nations, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others, do you think?
I think in some ways the White House has been perfectly happy with that. We've been perfectly happy with them sending in weapons, so we don't have to get, our boys don't have to get their hands dirty. We can play a dirty war with having our so-called allies provide weapons, using all sorts of cyber warfare and other kinds of covert activities to try to destabilize the country that has led to literally nearly 100,000 people dead.
Might this not be a successful route, though, if the overarching goal is to weaken Iran in a very kind of cynical realpolitik way, no matter what the human cost, might it not be successful? Isn't Iran in a quagmire then?
Well, it has been problematic for Iran because Iran has stood by the Syrian government for a variety of reasons, though in the greater geostrategic picture, they have thought this, what they call an Islamic awakening through the Middle East, is more important than sustaining the Assad government, because any change anywhere that would bring a government into power that would be more independent, more reflective of its people's desires and wishes, would be less pro-American, therefore a win for Iran. So strategically, the Iranians have supported the Syrian government, but not absolutely. But this has hurt them because particularly from the Arab side of the Gulf, you've had a very targeted campaign to make this not an issue of people wanting independence, but a sectarian issue. And that has certainly, you can see it in the polls in terms of their perception of Iran, their perception of Hezbollah. It has hurt both of them. But at the end of the day, I'm just back from Beirut. From what I understand from people on the ground in Lebanon with close ties to Hezbollah and others, is that at the end of the day, they think that the sectarian issue will die on the altar of Israel and the United States, and people eventually realizing that this is all about dominance and hegemony.
If we wanted to stop the killing, if we were genuine about that, what would be the way out?
We would accept the numerous offers by Russia, China, Iran, the Syrian government to sit down and negotiate. The only people who are saying no to going to Geneva are the rebels, the United States, and our so-called allies. We're the ones who are saying no to negotiations. 2 years ago, we could have been in negotiations. 2 years, 93,000 people earlier who are now dead. We could have been in negotiations. We're the ones who are saying no, not the people that we've demonized here.
Hilary Mann Leverett, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the Oscar-winning film Black Swan depicted the mental and emotional breakdown of a ballerina. 2 interns who worked on that movie, though, weren't provoked into a psychotic rage by their experience in the manner of the film's protagonist, but they were motivated to file a lawsuit against Fox Searchlight Pictures. They argue they should have been paid for their work. And on Tuesday, a federal district court judge ruled that the production company had indeed violated federal and New York minimum wage laws by not paying them. It's a ruling that could have profound implications, not just for the film industry, but for labor practices across the United States. I spoke to one of the former interns who won the case, Eric Glatt.
I had worked in the independent film industry before, mostly in documentary films. I had left AIG in the spring of 2009, not long after the financial crisis, and decided I wanted to focus my energies working in the film industry again, willing to accept just basically more kinds of work that became available to me. And when the opportunity presented itself to intern on a feature production with a named director and a named, well-known lead, I thought that would be a great opportunity to break in. And the thing is, that industry, like journalism and like so many other culture production industries today, the way you get your foot in the door is by doing an unpaid internship.
So, your foot in the door, what were your duties during this internship?
Well, so when I met with the hiring producer, we discussed internships in a variety of departments. That production used interns to do entry-level work in any number of different non-union departments. So I took my internship in the accounting department, and I performed all of the normal, ordinary duties of an accounting clerk. If I wasn't there, they would have had to get someone else to do it.
Right, so what's so wrong with that?
What's so wrong with what? Performing labor for a profit-making enterprise that
but to get your foot in the door.
Doesn't compensate you? Well, first of all, what I was happy to find out around the time that the production was winding down, thanks to the Department of Labor and a story in the New York Times, was it wasn't legal. You can't derive profit-making labor from people without paying them a minimum wage. The minimum wage was set in this country 75 years ago this month as a key cornerstone piece of the New Deal. So to argue, most of the arguments I've heard against unpaid internships, whether they intend to or not, are basically structured argument. They're the same structure of argument that you'd make to say there shouldn't be a minimum wage at all.
But when you spoke to management about this, about your concerns then, what did they say? I mean, was their argument that this was part of some sort of structured internship which would then lead to a more permanent position? Was there any interest in further vocational development for you, or was it simply, no, this is just You're an intern.
Oh, no, there was no pretense that this was a training program. This was a production like so many other film, television productions. You can go to Craigslist, you can check out the Industry Insider Guide, the UTA job list, and you will see productions on this coast, on the West Coast, that are basically staffing their needs, finding staff to meet their needs by advertising for skilled professionals and not paying them by calling it an internship.
But if you hadn't spoken out, couldn't you subsequently, though, have said, look, I was one of the accountants on Black Swan, this major motion
accounting
picture,
clerk,
or I was working on the accounts of. Isn't that going to help your future employment prospects?
Well, for some people, after they do 1, 2, 3, 7, I've heard from somebody doing upwards of 7 unpaid internships. For some people, it might eventually work out for them individually, but that doesn't negate the fact that this is causing harm to the rest of the labor market, and for a lot of people, it doesn't work out. I mean, how many times are you supposed to pull the lever on the slot machine before your bank account is depleted? And the thing is, this is taking away paid jobs from other people who are out there freelancing, looking for work, who have bills to pay. I can't go to my landlord and tell him that I'm willing to be his tenant for his experience being a landlord.
You know, what's so interesting about your story is that you began then in the financial industry, or at least you had a large stint in the financial sector,
yes.
AIG. It's precisely the financial sector, arguably, that's driven corporations to simply maximize shareholder value and profitability at the expense of labor rights and social value, arguably. And of course, now you've sort of come full circle, and now you seem to be, an activist for labor rights. I mean, can you see that journey and how ironic it is?
Oh yeah, no. To me, I guess it has an ironic element to it, but it makes a lot of internal sense. I think the combination of the financial crisis itself sort of got me off the agnostic fence that I think a lot of people are expected to sit on. Our politics may be one thing, but we feel like we have to do what we have to do to get ahead in this world and to take care of ourselves. Both my parents' families lost everything in World War II and came here with absolutely nothing. So the primary focus on financial security, I think it was what makes a lot of people hold their noses while they engage in activities they might necessarily politically agree with. But I think in the wake of the financial crisis, and then when it was time for me to speak out about this particular labor practice, I just realized it was time to speak a little more truthfully about what was really on my mind. And if that jeopardized my future in one industry, I hope that it will open up other doors. And the thing is, we filed this suit within around 2 weeks of the beginning of Occupy Wall Street. And the timing was totally coincidental, but it couldn't have been better, because it really told me I wasn't alone in my concern, and there was something really fundamentally and structurally wrong with the way this economy is set up.
I'm joined from New York by Ross Perlin, author of Intern Nation. And here in the studio is Ross Eisenberry, Vice President of the Economic Policy Institute. Let's run through, first of all, the rather stringent criteria, impressive criteria in the Fair Labor Act for unpaid internships. First of all, the internship has to be similar to training in an educational environment. It has to be for the intern's benefit. The intern cannot displace existing employees and has to work under the supervision of current staff. The employer providing the training can't derive immediate advantage from the intern's work. The intern isn't necessarily entitled to a job when the internship ends, and both the employer and the intern understand that the intern isn't entitled to wages for their work. So that's the rather specific criteria, really. Ross Perlin, looking at that, though, you have to wonder, after this court case, which clearly has the potential to be appealed, about how many others in the U.S. are now consulting their lawyers.
This was the first of what are now seven other lawsuits which have been filed just in the last 2 years. The Black Swan case was the first. It's the first to be resolved in court. There was another one that involved the Charlie Rose television personality that settled out of court. But what we're seeing is, even yesterday, a new suit against Condé Nast, the media empire here in New York. And it's clear that there are other cases like this in the pipeline. From my research, there are possibly thousands of illegal internships happening each year in the United States. There is widespread kind of ignoring of the law that's been going on because the law hasn't been directly enforced. And I think what we're now seeing is potentially the floodgates are opening. People are realizing the conditions of the 6-point test that you just mentioned that fits on one piece of paper and it's widely circulating on the internet. It was printed up in my book. I think a few years ago people were not even aware that that test existed, and that's based on an old Supreme Court case, excuse me, from 1947. And I think very clearly, the logic of that decision was echoed a few days ago in Judge Pauley's decision here in New York, basically saying that there's only a kind of a narrow scope for not paying people if you are a for-profit employer. Basically, it has to be a training program, a bona fide training program. Otherwise, you have to be paying minimum wage, overtime for overtime hours, and so on.
I mean, that's what's so interesting, Ross Eisenberry. These are pretty great rules, but they're just not enforced. And in our deregulated economy, it's just quite nice to see that these rules are at least there, even if I guess they haven't been enforced then. But
well, for 30 years, our enforcement has been shrinking, labor law enforcement, starting in the Reagan administration when the Labor Department enforcement budget was cut in half. It's never been restored. And at the state level, you have states like Florida that have done away with their labor departments. So we see all across labor law sort of lawlessness, a sort of Wild West mentality. Employers are able to get away with a lot, and the more they get away with, the more they think they're entitled to get away with it.
Right, and in that sense, then, this issue of internships is symptomatic of wider labor issues in the economy. Before we get onto those, though, as far as internships are concerned, Ross Perlin, and let's go through some of the objections to this ruling. In fact, I saw a headline this morning, quote, "Lawyers threaten to ruin unpaid internships," was the quote. The suggestion being that upholding these sorts of worker protections is going to have a negative impact on the ability of young people in particular to gain the necessary work experience to become productive members of the workforce.
Well, I think it's important to start by saying that there are great situations out there. People have benefited from internships. Arguably, internships started out as a kind of a great idea. This was the idea to have, kind of a white-collar apprenticeship. The practice started, over a century ago. The first kind of interns came about. That term started to be used, referring to young doctors in a transitional period between medical school and full entry into the profession. Then it was kind of taken over by other fields, especially following World War II, corporate America. And these were usually paid positions. There was a focus on kind of training and recruiting, on trying to get as many of the interns to then be full-time employees as possible, on really kind of actively training and mentoring them. And what's happened really in the last few decades, and this is a process that I've traced and that's really been accelerating, and then particularly kind of exacerbated by the recession of the last several years, but has been going on now for a few decades, is that it's become a way for companies to get a kind of a cheap, if not free, disposable labor force, to the point where now between a third and half of all internships are estimated to be unpaid. And many more are low-paid or just stipended, where the training is not being provided. So, very much a well-intentioned thing, something that, many people have tried to kind of give an educational component to. Universities have tried to be involved as well and add that kind of component. But really a system that in many ways has gone off the rails. And I think, there are people, again, who are able to sort of benefit from the system as it is, but that's become increasingly difficult to do. And for a lot of people, on top of, record levels of youth unemployment, on top of rising tuition, on top of these levels of student debt that we see, unpaid internships have become the straw that breaks the camel's back.
So this is where we then begin to see the wider impact of internships. So this isn't just some sort of compartmentalized necessary evil, but it does have a knock-on effect on the rest of society. For example, who can afford to take unpaid internships, Ross Eisenberry? I mean, what has this done to social mobility and the prospect of social mobility, I guess?
Who can afford that? Not a working class kid, not someone from poor parents, probably not even lower middle class. Farther up the ladder, that's who can do it, and that limits the exposure of the broad most Americans to government, to get their foot into the door of government. It has a lot of effects.
But Ross Eisenberry, how did we get to the point of such widespread flouting of the pretty clear rules on internship, the normalization of an exploitative rather than an educational internship, perhaps? Is that connected to other social factors, perhaps, then, do you think?
Well, I think that there is for 30 years there's been a growing disrespect for government, a sense of entitlement in corporate America. The minimum wage, this is about the minimum wage. The minimum wage has fallen over this time period from about half of the average wage to down to 37%. That's a loss of from $10 an hour to $7.25. That's where we are now. So the minimum wage itself has sort of been disrespected by our society, and employers, you know, they don't want to pay even that much.
Ross Perlin, what was interesting about Eric Glatt's case, though, is, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, he's no spring chicken, right? He's not someone you think of as an intern necessarily. And he was discussing there how companies were specifically advertising for highly skilled interns, people who've already got their work experience, and, you know, who have the credentials and so forth. I mean, this is quite flabbergasting in some ways as well. This is, again, what we assumed the internship program is to be about. I mean, is this really is it really so open as a corporate ruse, perhaps?
I think one thing that I try to emphasize is that when people think of the word internship, they think of something that you maybe do once during a collegiate summer, you know, that you do when you're 20 or 21 or, you know, something like that, and then you get a taste of something, and then you have the opportunity to kind of move on in the labor market. Increasingly, that's not the case. I've documented what I call the rise of the serial intern. This is people increasingly having to do 3, 4, 5, 7 or more, as Eric Glatt mentioned, internships in order to be able to supposedly break in, although even at that level, then you may still be doing kind of freelance or precarious labor. So there is a kind of wider connection to the rise of precarious labor conditions in general in the economy. Internships are just kind of one of the roles, along with freelancers, temps, perma-temps, various kinds of independent contractors. This has become much more the kind of the way of employment, because companies want to have that kind of flexibility.
Right.
And so I think, you know, we are seeing more kind of older interns. We're seeing people doing internships when they're even younger. We're seeing people doing it when they're transitioning between careers. It's not unusual. And some of the ads you see, I mean, just go on Craigslist, just look around the internet for the kinds of experience that people are looking for in their interns, and not promising any kind of training, and really expecting you to do something on day one.
Oh, Ross Eisenberry, though, what Ross Perlin calls precarious labor conditions is called by others labor flexibility. You know, the economy has changed. That's just the way it is.
Well, it's changing, but it's changing in ways that have increased the bargaining power of corporations and shareholders, the people who control the jobs.
And that's supposed to help all of us, though, as a result.
Well, I don't know that it's supposed to. It doesn't help all of us. I mean, you can look at the figures. Over the last 30 years, the share of wealth held by the bottom 60% of Americans has declined. I mean, they've lost wealth. It's not just that their share of the total economy has declined. They are poorer. The bottom 60% of Americans are poorer than they were.
Are corporations even bothering then to give an economic reason for this sort of labor practice? And, or is it just
they'll say that flexibility is good for them, and what's good for GE is good for America. But I don't think it's a well thought out, rational argument. You look at what's happened to the real entry-level wages of college graduates, and many of them are now graduating from schools, even Ivy League schools, and going into unpaid internships. From 2000 to 2011, for men, the entry-level wage fell from $23.50 about to $21.68. For women, they fell too. Men are actually no better off today, after all of the growth in our economy, than they were in 1973.
Right, but then, and finally, Ross Perlin, I mean, we've heard these statistics for ages about the enormous disparities in wealth, the increasing disparities in wealth. Is this court case a harbinger of good things to come then, that the surrender to corporate as opposed to social good is now coming to an end, or what do you make of it? Are we seeing a rebalancing in the offing?
I think in a small way, this fight against unpaid internships, which is taking on, I think, some of the dimensions of a social movement, playing itself out through these many lawsuits, playing itself out through other forms of protests, such as we've had here at NYU, with an effort to try to get the university to stop advertising unpaid internships. It's happening in many different ways, just on this issue. And I think that's also a symptom of a way in which certainly people my age, I'm 30, people who've been faced with this labor market, have a sense of downward mobility and pessimism about their prospects, are looking at ways to kind of to fight back and to improve their condition, and to kind of raise the baseline that has been beaten down over the years, as we heard from Ross Eisenberry. So I think this is a hopeful sign that that there may be change in the air. We may be beginning to see the end of the unpaid internship and the rise of more just arrangements.
We'll see. Ross Eisenberry, thank you very much. Ross Perlin, thank you as well. Sorry, that's the moment I get the Rosses mixed up. Ross Eisenberry, thank you very much. Ross Perlin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.